When asked the question of what anime I'd recommend to a person just getting into anime, there's one that invariably comes to mind for me, and that's Mob Psycho 100. This is a show that I feel is going to give you a really good feeling of what anime has to offer. The storytelling is pretty indicative of what anime tends to be, the characters are really good, and the powers are rather commonplace, especially compared to the other shonen power sets you'll find out there. On top of that, the messaging isn't all that hard to swallow, and it's also reasonably short, clocking in at 3 seasons of 12 20-minute episodes. That makes it far less daunting a task than recommending hundreds of episodes of Titan shonen battle anime like Naruto, One Piece, Bleach, or Dragon Ball. It's fun, overall well paced, and gives action the right treatment to make it look and feel like the moments are actually intense. So, in spite of some of the rather goofy things you can find in this series, the show is otherwise pretty tame if you're looking for something to recommend to a noob. But on top of being one of my picks for anime noobs, it's also an incredible anime for veterans as well. It's really well paced and stays mostly within its boundaries of reason and treats action sequences with the love and respect they deserve. It also demonstrates some creative writing elements in balancing powers, developing characters, and telling the story appropriate to the age of the characters involved. So what's the synopsis? Mob, or Shigeo Kageyama as he's actually named, is a middle school boy living in Seasoning City. He's highly underwhelming, and even absolutely pathetic in just about every way a boy could be. He's not athletic, he's not good looking, he's not personable, he's not studious. However, he is one of the most gifted telekinetics in the world. To Mob, though, his powers are nothing special. In fact, he likes to distance himself from them as much as possible, and refuses to use them to hurt people unless he's absolutely pushed to the limit. As a young kid, Mob severely injured people in an outburst of anger, and the result of what was a somewhat justified instance of anger scared him. So naturally, he decides to suppress his powers and bottle up his emotions so that he would not hurt other people. However, life is not so nice at times, and he is tested again and again on controlling his abilities. His attempt to seal his emotions and contain his powers backfires. When his emotions build to a maximum and he can no longer contain them, he becomes an entirely different person, and the otherwise ordinary young man becomes an unstoppable force. The unfortunate reality of that makeshift solution is that it intensifies his unbound outbursts, and that's not lost on him. He even shows remorse over a few incidents he causes when pushed to the brink by other people. Still, Mob prefers to live his life without using his powers, in spite of insistence from other characters. He could easily captivate people with his powers if he really wanted to, but he chooses to chase popularity on his own strength. He can reinforce his body beyond belief, and his telekinetic abilities can destroy entire city blocks with ease. But he still trains his body with the Body Improvement Club in spite of that. And a large portion of that mentality stems from the words of the man Mob looks up to the most in the world, the con artist and fake psychic genius Reigen Arataka. Shortly after his initial outburst that made him scared of his own powers, Mob sought out the advice of Reigen, mistakenly thinking the man was a master of such things. And Reigen's wisdom, that his powers didn't make him that special and that he was still human, and should use his talents wisely, resonated with him. Ultimately, this is a story of self-improvement, about Mob coming to terms with the parts of himself he's terrified of. Fearing his powers as something that can harm people, he attempts to make himself stronger without them so he won't have to rely on them. But, as I said, his attempts to contain his emotions only intensified his outbursts and actually created a pseudo-split personality, one that begins to take over when he's completely overwhelmed by his bottled-up emotions. Overall, Mob Psycho is a great story about self-improvement, but it also carries some touches about how natural talent can make you arrogant, and that all people are equal regardless of the gifts they were born with. This much of the story is depicted through Teruki Hanazawa and the Boss of Claw, a secretive organization of powerful espers looking to conquer the world. Teruki, or Teru as he's more commonly referred to in the series, starts off as a self-aggrandizing leader of a school full of delinquents. After an incident engineered by one of Mob's schoolmates, Teru is forced to come to terms with the fact that he's not all that special. Basically, he tries to prove that he's the best to Mob and accidentally awakens the sleeping monster inside the kid's head. After this very humbling experience, Teru is forced to accept that he's not actually the king of the world as he initially thought, and ultimately becomes a really good friend to Mob. Something similar can be said for the Boss of Claw. He spends years amassing power, proving his superiority over all living things, only to be met and matched by a middle schooler who then saves his life. Eventually, after a second encounter with Mob's full power, the boss comes to the realization that his powers are nothing, choosing to abandon his goals of world domination in favor of trying to pick up the pieces of his broken family he drove away during the pursuit of his goals. The majority of characters in this show are very dynamic. Most of the villains end up abandoning their evil goals in the long run. Dimple gives up on his dream of becoming God after a confrontation with Mob. Most of the major members of Claw turn traitor and end up getting normal jobs and living normal lives. There are also minor characters who appear only occasionally, who go from standoffish or aggressive to more friendly and personable. There's a lot of movement along alignment charts, which make the story a whole lot better. Most characters don't emerge unscathed ideologically from their encounters. Even Mob is forced to recognize his own flaws and failures in each battle. But this movement isn't limited to just villain characters. Neutral and hero characters experience this too. Ritsu is a good example of another character who sways throughout the story. He fears his older brother Shigeo, and walks on eggshells around him and tries not to trigger any explosions. He even goes so far as to falsely frame several schoolmates just to keep them from setting Mob off. Eventually, the stress manifests his own psychic powers, the one thing he wanted but didn't have, and it causes him to develop a bit of a superiority complex and completely turn on his brother. He vents his pent-up anxiety and frustration at Mob in the climax of his villain arc, but ultimately realizes that he wants to support his brother now that he actually has the power to do so. Characters are so well constructed in this show, and their varying moral alignments, conflicting ideologies, and regular challenging each other on things helps push both the story and the character development. Mob isn't just a force of change. He changes too at the persuasion of others, particularly Reigen. Reigen's role as the mentor character is saddled by the baggage of the fact that he's using Mob to make money. But even for as scummy as that is, Reigen proves to be more a good aligned character. He helps defend Mob against scammers, encourages Mob to achieve his goals, and reminds the boy that he doesn't have to fight just because he has powers. You know, the "it's okay to run away" scene. He may seem like scum at first, but by the end of the series, he's arguably the most lovable character there. His arc isn't as huge as Shifting Alliances, but he is forced to reflect on his decisions and ultimately choose a path of being a good man. Enough about character development, though. As much as that's a huge part of the story, there's another very attractive thing about this show: the action. Each and every major action sequence is accompanied by great combat animation. The visuals alone give you the feeling that battles are important, and they rate some of my favorite fights in anime. But more than that, battles are great structurally. Keep in mind, Mob's powers qualify him for instant wins in most cases. Fights are a good mix of even matches and absolutely stone-cold dominations. It helps keep tension that Mob's powers aren't constantly at 100%, like most other shows would allow. It's also in theme with his character as to not want to hurt people by going all out against an opponent, and he only does so when he explodes after being pushed too far. This little creative device is pretty effective at keeping things in check, and allowing other characters to have an influence on the battle itself, rather than just having Mob wipe the floor with every enemy all the time. And for pacing, the show does really well. Every season has something like 2 huge fight scenes that are well animated and very integral to the plot, and the remainder of the time addresses the overall tone of the show, making sure you get a good dose of that wholesome Mob Psycho storytelling while still keeping you hyped for those huge confrontations that are bound to happen. And in spite of the show being really compact, the arcs don't feel rushed at all, and most of them are really well written. This is, though, where I have to put in my one complaint, and I have to say that there's one arc that was pretty boring and rather forgettable near the end. While it was pretty wholesome fun, it still felt like it was a detour from the show and didn't matter in the grand scheme of things. You could pretty much cut it out and did not have missed anything. Overall, though, Mob Psycho 100 gets a 9.7 out of 10 from me. It's well-rounded in everything I think anime should be, and it's solid enough and compact enough for me to feel confident in recommending it to other people who have little to no experience in anime. It's also made a home for itself in my top 3 favorite anime of all time due to its great animation, solid storytelling, and large number of lovable characters. Well, no, I guess that's about all out of me. Like, subscribe, comment, do all that stuff. If you have disagreements, you can voice them down in the comments section, and I will fight you. Just kidding. Have a great day and a wonderful rest of your week. Later.
Try to bottle it up, push it away. Garner the strength, but when the pendulum sways, my mind it goes dark. I'm not in control.